BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. And just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we begin. The first is that there is now a regular series on this channel devoted to Jack the Ripper, which comes out every Wednesday. And on the weekends, I've been doing another bonus series about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. And in addition to that, there's of course the Anything Goes Friday, where any subject is fair game. And some great ways that you can support all of these efforts and this channel as a whole are by just hitting the like button, subscribing, sharing with your friends and family if you know anyone who is curious about true crime cases, as well as going over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help this program, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And also, I should remind you guys that there is a podcast out there called Serial Killers Z to A. I am the narrator of it, even though I just jumbled the title. Serial Killers Z to A. Yes, indeed. Of course, that sounded a little bit better the second time around. And it is firstly devoted to the Zodiac Killer, but perhaps some new stories will be coming up in the near future on that podcast. You can get it anywhere you download podcasts, including iHeartRadio and Spotify. Now, I found a rather interesting YouTube video recently, and it is on the channel Mindshock. It is called The Zodiac Killer, The Darlene Ferrin Connection, and it actually came out 10 months ago, according to YouTube. However, I just watched some of it recently because it is around 4 hours long, a very long presentation. Once again, it's called The Zodiac Killer, The Darlene Ferrin Connection, and this was a video that succeeded for me because it asked challenge questions to the listeners and viewers, and you guys know that is something that I participate in a lot, especially even here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. But the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in the 1960s. The first Zodiac Killer crime took place on December 20th of 1968 with the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. They are called the Lake Herman Road murders. And the second crime that took place was the shooting at Blue Rock Springs Park, which saw the murder of Darlene Ferrin on the 4th of July. Although in this particular video, the presenter estimated that the time of the shooting was actually 12:02 a.m. on July 5th of 1969. When I've looked at the timeline myself in the past, I estimated 11:55 p.m. on July 4th of 1969, but it's all within the same range, very, very close time frames. I mean, I'm sure all of us would like to know the exact minute in which the crime took place, because it's going to be relevant to all of the surrounding information. But I said that there were some challenge questions that were asked in this video, and that was, number 1, did Darlene Ferrin personally know the Zodiac Killer? And I'm glad the presenter asked this question because it is something that I am so horribly divided on And one reason is that I'm tempted to approach the Zodiac Killer mystery with a sense of skepticism, as well as trying to use some type of Occam's razor thinking, and just looking at a very simple explanation and just thinking, no, Darlene Ferrin didn't know the Zodiac Killer. She was a random victim, that there was just a single person who committed a crime spree in 1968 and 69. The victims were not pre-chosen. The locations were chosen because of convenience. Maybe the dates had some significance to the killer, but they were mostly chosen at random, and this has been explored time and time again. Even the people who think that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer have looked toward this particular angle, thinking that, oh, well, some dates were chosen at random, and it was to commit crimes without a particular pattern so that no one could ever figure out what the killer was doing. But at the same time, some people do indeed think that Arthur Lee Allen knew Darlene Ferrin, but I believe on a personal level that a lot of that comes from Robert Graysmith messing around with the narrative. Robert Graysmith, the author of Zodiac and Zodiac Unmasked, and featured in the David Fincher film from 2007, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, was somebody who didn't always tell the truth. He may have written an enormous amount of true crime books. I mean, and he spent time working for multiple newspapers in his life, but he did not tell the truth completely about the Zodiac Killer, and I think that that's a rather well-established fact, not only with his Zodiac Killer book from 1986, which he's most famous for, but with all of his true crime books. I mean, you just look at the reviews of them online, and you'll see he gets accused of not telling the complete truth. So, I said, though, that I was divided on the possibility of Darlene Ferrin knowing the Zodiac, and it has nothing to do with Arthur Lee Allen, to be very precise. That was just one example of how some people think Darlene Ferrin knew Arthur Lee Allen and some people don't. But I do stand by everything that I said about how there's just this single killer who went after people in secluded areas, and Darlene Ferrin was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's the end of it, and anything else is just some type of untrue connection. But what's the other side of the story? What's the other side of the coin? Back in 2019 and 2020, I talked a lot about the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, which was put forward by Thomas Henry Horan. And it's the idea that the Zodiac Killer was not a real serial killer, and even after multiple Zodiac murders, there were these letters that come in. They're the cryptograms, the Z408 ciphers, the first, and the Z340 was the second in 1969, then the Z13 and Z32 ciphers. So the Zodiac isn't only a serial killer, he's also writing letters taking credit for the murders, and then creating these crypto puzzles, which are called the ciphers or the cryptograms. But I did not completely accept that there was this theory that there wasn't an actual serial killer called the Zodiac, and that someone was just writing letters taking credit for crimes that he didn't commit. What I thought was the most valuable part of the hoax theory was the idea that the same person who committed the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting was not the same person who committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing and the Stein murder. And I'll be even more precise, that the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting were committed by different people. I mean, two different assailants in those. And then whatever happened after that, well, that's a different story altogether, because, I mean, even when you read The Myth of the Zodiac Killer by Thomas Henry Horan, it doesn't exactly state this, but after the Blue Rock Springs shooting and the murder of Darlene Ferrin, the hoax theory takes on a life of its own, and then there is a real Zodiac killer, and even the explanations that are put forward in that book aren't completely sound, that someone is only writing letters taking credit for murders that he didn't commit. And that isn't simply my observation. Lots of people have come to that conclusion, and one of them was Michael Butterfield, the editor of ZodiacKillerFacts.com, who wrote an 8-part article series about the Zodiac hoax theory. And in part 8, he stated very clearly that based on this narrative, I mean, this is not a hoax. There is a Zodiac killer who would have been responsible for not only obstruction of justice, but also orchestrating the murder of Cecilia Shepard, possibly murdering Paul Stein. And that's not the Zodiac hoax. That's the Zodiac co-conspiracy. And I mean, I would agree with that in one particular variant of the hoax theory. But the first Zodiac crime, again, the Lake Herman Road murders, and the second Zodiac crime, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, had the potential to be drug-related or gang-related shootings. And one theory is that Darlene Ferrin drove to Blue Rock Springs Park on July 4th of 1969 with Mike Mageau in the passenger seat, and they were going there to buy drugs, specifically marijuana and some pills, and that they were not doing anything that was extremely hard or heavy. These would have just been very casual drugs from my understanding. And when I was watching this video about the Darlene Ferrin connection on the Mindshock channel, one thing that is argued by the presenter is that that theory is most likely false, and he stated that, I mean, he's not sharing the documents on the screen, but he said that he read something in the police reports about how Darlene Ferrin had only 13 cents on her person at the time of the shooting, or that when they went through her things, she only had 13 cents, and that her brother Leo even made the statement that she didn't go there to buy drugs, and that it was something that he had talked about with her, but that was not the exact reason. And the presenter was more or less proposing that Darlene Ferrin went there to have a conversation with Mike Mageau, and she's even telling people earlier on in the day that she wants to tell Michael something. But, I mean, they would have had more than enough time throughout the course of the evening to exchange words. I mean, like, she would have had more than enough time to tell him something. And Mike Mageau would have been in the passenger seat, and Darlene Ferrin would have been in the driver's seat. But, I mean, if you're going to explore this possibility of it being a drug deal gone wrong, and that someone else took credit for it in a letter, um, I'm really not sure if that presenter's claim is 100% verified that they didn't go to the park for a drug-related reason. Um, I mean, I think that that's a very bold statement that isn't extremely widely discussed. Now, Mike Mageau seemed to be somewhat infatuated with Darlene Ferrin, and even though she was married to Dean Ferrin, her maiden name was Suenin, but I mean, it seems like he genuinely had feelings for her and wanted to be much closer to her than he was in terms of a relationship. But did one of them know the drug dealer that could have been present at Blue Rock Springs Park, and then it turned out to be some type of drug-related or gang-related shooting? Now, how would that take place at Blue Rock Springs? Well, Officer Richard Hoffman was patrolling the area just prior to the shooting, and did somebody think that it was a setup, or that it was like some type of sting operation, and that person just started firing at them? And that would be something that Mike Mageau would have kept quiet about, because he knew that if he said anything about, oh yeah, well, we went there to buy drugs and this drug dealer tried to murder me, well then he would have been murdered as soon as he got out of the hospital, because that would have just created an even larger situation for him. I mean, perhaps he wasn't thinking about something such as witness protection, but, I mean, that just becomes a wild theory. And I do mean that. That just becomes some type of wild theory. It's just all about mental gymnastics, and you have to make the assumption, more or less, that Darlene Ferrin drove the car to Blue Rock Springs Park with Mike Michaud in the passenger seat because they had this expectation of meeting some type of invisible, imaginary figure that we can't name precisely. Yeah, we can guess about it all days long. We can talk about it until the cows come home. But is that what really happened? Or was it rather similar to the Lake Herman Road murders, when you got a man and a woman in a car? They drive to an area where they think they're going to be alone, maybe intimacy is on the mind of at least one of the people there, but also they're just going there for conversations as well as perhaps some type of very gentle activity. I'm going to be careful with my words. And then they got blindsided by the Zodiac killer, meaning that the victims were not pre-chosen, but the locations were chosen because of convenience. So, what do you think? Did Darlene Ferrin know her attacker at Blue Rock Springs? Did Darlene Ferrin know the Zodiac killer? And a couple follow-ups that I will add to that are very simple. Number one, I received a message once from Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com where he stated that he had been discussing this exact issue with Ken Narlow, and it relates to Tom Voigt's suspect, Richard Gaikowski, and that Ken Narlow stated that he could place Richard Gaikowski in Darlene Ferrin's home in the months prior to her murder. And that is one thing I'd like to share with you, and that again is based on someone else's investigation and testimony. But I also want to share the theory that Darlene Ferrin could have been the target for the entirety of the Zodiac crimes, and it's the idea that a single person was targeted, and then a string of unrelated murders were committed to cover it up under the name of the Zodiac Killer. And that would also be the explanation about why there were so few Zodiac homicides. December 20th of 1968, July 4th of 1969, September 27th of 1969, and October 11th of 1969, with the murders of Cecilia Shepard and Paul Stein being the final two, respectively. So, I mean, this has been shared a lot in the comments section, and I think, again, it requires a little bit of mental gymnastics, but it's definitely been thought about. I mean, you can go through countless places on YouTube of hearing people say the exact same things, that they think Darlene Ferrin is the key to everything. She was the first Zodiac Killer victim I learned by name, actually. And even when I watched the three-part Zodiac Killer series on the Lord and Arts channel, it ultimately concludes with John Lord and the presenter saying, I think Darlene is the key to everything. And I did an episode back in 2019 when I was discussing this subject, and I thought it was rather simple. Number one, Darlene Ferrin worked in a restaurant, and it just creates a very opportunistic angle for people to insert their suspects when they say, oh, well, this suspect lived close to the restaurant where Darlene Ferrin worked. Or even better, they would say, well, this suspect matches the description of someone who was harassing Darlene Ferrin at a restaurant. And I just thought that it was a very convenient angle, as opposed to somebody like Cecilia Shepard, who was a college student, or Betty Lou Jensen was a high school student. I mean, how would you be able to place somebody as it would, like, what would they just be like? Well, they were a regular passerby to Betty Lou Jensen's high school. No, I don't think so. But somebody also responded to the episode Darlene Ferrin Conspiracies by saying that a lot of the Darlene Ferrin conspiracies come from Pam Huckabee, also known as Pam Suennen, Darlene Ferrin's sister, who just became somewhat of a mouthpiece and shared a lot of disinfo about the Zodiac Killer mystery. And why she did that, well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, and I mean, I've never approached her directly about the subject, so I think that's something that's just in her own mind. But she didn't appear to be completely consistent with all of her statements regarding Darlene's death. But again, I'll turn the question over to you. Do you think Darlene Ferrin knew the Zodiac Killer personally? Believe it or not, the first time I heard of this theory of how a single victim can be targeted and then a series of unrelated murders happens to cover it up was on an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger with Chuck Norris. And I didn't even know this at the time, but I was growing up, in a divorced family. I mean, I would spend the weekdays with my mother and the weekends at my father's house. And we would often watch Walker, Texas Ranger on CBS, as well as some other TV shows. And I didn't know that they were reruns airing at that time, but we weren't even watching them live. I thought they all came out live on Saturday night. Maybe they did. I don't know. That's just what some family members told me. But there was this one episode of Walker, Texas Ranger, where they talked about how these assassins would murder people with knives made of ice, and that way the ice would melt, and then the murder weapon would be destroyed, and they would murder 7 people in a geographic area, so then the people would think, oh, there's some type of ice knife killer on the loose, when in reality it's just paid for hitmen, like hits for hire assassins targeting a specific person and then murdering 6 unrelated people that were chosen randomly by a computer as a way to cover up the crimes to confuse the authorities. Now, when you put that in the perspective of the Zodiac killer, that would make sense. I mean, that one victim was targeted and that 4 other people were murdered. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, and perhaps 2 other people were also possible victims, but they were able to survive, meaning Mike Mageau and Brian Hartnell. And then the Zodiac crime stopped after the murder of Paul Stein, and then the person maybe got addicted to the thrill of the experience but didn't have the need to commit any more murders, so he just keeps on writing letters well into the 1970s. I mean, perhaps going up to 1971 with the Pleasanton letter, and then, of course, resurfacing in 1974 with the Exorcist letter. So I follow that. I completely follow that. But how on earth can you defend a theory like that without making some type of assumption? I mean, that's a little bit beyond me. But I would like to switch topics a little bit and talk about some material that is connected to the Anything Goes Friday segment, which I did last week. And I was discussing the documentary Suburban Nightmare Chris Watts, where I was responding to this film that I watched on Tubi about the Watts family murders. Chris Watts was a family annihilator, which is the term for someone who murders their family. And the reason why I want to share this on Zodiac Monday is because I think that this type of crime is so different than the behaviors and actions of the Zodiac killer. And the Zodiac crimes do not seem to have a very strong motive. The Zodiac crimes do not seem to have the clearest sense of, well, anything, to be honest. But with the actions of a family annihilator, there's usually a very clear reason why the crimes were committed. For example, with the story of Chris Watts, I almost certainly think that he did it so he could have access to more sexual partners without the financial burden of having a family. And I didn't really articulate that the best way on the Anything Goes Friday segment, but you had the story of a man who was trying to lose weight and get into shape, and then he started receiving attention from females other than his wife, and he had 2 kids and a third child on the way. She was pregnant at the time of her murder, and he started having an affair. And I mean, of course, people believe he committed the murders so he could be with his new lover, but I mean, you don't have to commit the murders to do that. And the thing that I didn't completely express was something that it was hard to put into words, and it's almost as if perhaps he felt that he ended up with his wife because he was not attractive to other women at that point, and once he realized that he had the ability to attract other women by altering his appearance, then he thought, I'm only with her because I couldn't get anybody else at the time, and now I can. But he didn't want to deal with the financial hardships of having a divorced family, so he murdered his wife and 2 daughters, as well as his unborn child. And I know that sounds outrageous and ridiculous, but that's more or less what happened with Chris Watts, and that's why people are so disgusted by him, and that's why I called him the world's most selfish murderer. And if you look at that narrative, that's just so clear. That's just so consistent. There is a reason. There's a direct and and comprehensible narrative that can be established as to why this person committed the crimes. With the Zodiac, no, it's not like that at all. Number one, the Zodiac didn't commit all of his murders by gun. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, and Darlene Ferrin are shot, and then Cecilia Shepard is stabbed at Lake Berryessa, and then Paul Stein, the taxi driver, is shot in October of '69. The dates don't seem to make an enormous amount of sense. The letter writing isn't even always consistent. Sometimes the killer is using different penmanship. Prime example, the 1969 letters in July, and also the Melvin Belli letter in December of 1969. I shouldn't have said the 1969 letters, but the first Zodiac letters and the Melvin Belli letter, very different penmanship. But the Zodiac just doesn't seem to be consistent with anything that he does. So, I mean, it goes to show you that, number one, the true message of the Zodiac is not about gaining some type of personal benefit the way that a family annihilator such as Chris Watts did. It's not about gaining access to sexual partners or even financial rewards and incentives. It's about creating an image of terror, and it's about terrorizing the general public. It's about making people afraid, because the Zodiac said very clearly that he was going to go on a kill rampage. If you don't print this, or if you don't follow the Zodiac's instructions, he's going to go on a kill rampage. The Zodiac also threatened to detonate bombs, to attack school buses and children. The Zodiac also was just talking about feeling very lonely, and if he's ignored, he'll do his thing. And the Zodiac even said that he could do something very nasty, which you know he's capable of. The Zodiac Killer is all about creating this image of terror, but there's no real benefit to the person. He doesn't earn anything from this. If anything, he's risking his entire life by exposing himself to a certain degree with these letters, or he is willfully inserting this type of persona into the story, giving the police and the media copies of his handwriting, and not only do they have something to examine and investigate, he wanted the ciphers published in the newspaper so everybody could examine and investigate them. And, I mean, that just shows you that the Zodiac is about attention seeking, but also as a terrorist rather than some type of person who seeks to benefit from the crimes. And that ultimately, I think, is a key characteristic of the differences between the Zodiac Killer and a family annihilator such as Chris Watts. But after reading stories of other family annihilators such as Michael Lee Gambrill, who was responsible for, the Gambrill Axe murders, of course, hence the name, and he is a suspect in the possible Zodiac Killer crime, the Swindle murders of 1964, and he seemed to have moved about the country a little bit, and he's in Florida, and then Illinois, and then California, and he murdered his family with an axe. Now, he may have been someone who wasn't necessarily trying to gain money, and definitely not sex, from murdering his family. He is someone who wasn't the father, he was the son, but he may have just been dealing with pure mental instability. I mean, I can accept that all of these murderers are deranged. However, I mean, just dealing with some type of very intense mental health issues, and that's what drove him to kill. But with this subject, you can read all about this in a particular book, The Unabomber and the Zodiac by Douglas Oswell. And I confess that at first I thought the book was amazing, but then it got a little bit too bogged down on just that subject. I mean, looking at how both the Zodiac and the Unabomber were terrorists, and Douglas Oswell will say something to the effect of, well, the Zodiac threatened to go on a kill rampage, and the Unabomber sent bombs. Both of them are terrorists. And then 20 pages later, the author will say, well, both of them wanted to create the image of terror and scare the general public. It's just rephrasing the same ideas over and over again. So, to share something completely different, I would like to go back to another point from the Mindshock channel, because I said there were challenge questions. And here is another one for you. And that is that it involves the money that was left behind from the victims. And Brian Hartnell was approached by the Zodiac Killer at Lake Berryessa, and very clearly he said that he only had 75 cents when the Zodiac held him up at gunpoint. To add a little bit of context, the Zodiac holds up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. He's wearing a hooded costume, he's holding a gun, and he also had a knife with him. And he said, "All I want is your money. I'm an escaped convict. I'm just trying to get to Mexico and I need a car." I'm paraphrasing, but he needed money, and Brian Hartnell only had 75 cents. Another thing that was shared in that video that I stated already was that Darlene Ferrin had 13 cents on her person at the time, and the question that was asked was, doesn't it seem odd that multiple Zodiac Killer victims, if not all Zodiac Killer victims, were only left behind with spare change? This is partnered with the fact that the Zodiac Killer stole Paul Stein's wallet. And in all seriousness, Paul Stein was robbed. The Zodiac didn't just make it look like a taxi cab robbery. The Zodiac actually robbed Paul Stein, taking his keys and wallet. So, was there any possibility that other Zodiac Killer victims, such as David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, or Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were robbed, or that robbery was a major influence on the Zodiac's crimes? And the presenter in the Mindshock video didn't give us a second. He answers the question immediately. Well, you could think about that, but Mike Mageau survived the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and he certainly didn't state that the killer walked back and went through Darlene Ferrin's purse or anything, or that the killer walked back to Darlene Ferrin's side of the car and opened the door and was looking for any particular object of any kind. So it doesn't appear that robbery was the clear motive in that case. Now, some people have talked about a robbery at Lake Herman Road, but not exactly that the killer was trying to rob David Faraday. I mean, David Faraday was found clutching his class ring in his hands, and one thing that's been shared by you guys in the comments section is that, well, maybe he was about to give it to Betty Lou Jensen to ask her to be his steady girlfriend, and someone else wrote in to the comments saying that they thought that David Faraday thought they were going to be robbed, so he was going to offer them the class ring, but of course that was left behind. So the long story short is, no, I don't think that the Zodiac's primary motive was robbing the victims, or even secondary motive was robbing the victims, or even thirdly or fourthly thinking about robbing the victims. I tend to agree that the Zodiac mostly just wanted to commit a series of homicides and then use the media coverage around them to strike terror into the people of San Francisco and around the world. But what do you think? You can put your ideas in the comments section down below. I would love to read them and to read what you guys think about the Zodiac and his tendencies to lean toward robbery. Now, at this time, I would like to give a shout out to YouTube user Midnight Ventures, who proposed a discussion on the Connecticut River Valley Killer, which I talked about in a recent Zodiac Killer news report, and Midnight Ventures also made another request about discussing something related to the I-65 killer. I mentioned the I-65 killer in one recent Zodiac news report. Actually, I shouldn't say recent, it was about a year ago, to be honest. Sometimes all of the months get blended in together, and I've been doing the Zodiac Killer news report for just about a year. I mean, normally on Zodiac Mondays, I would talk about just individual topics, and then about a year ago, I decided to arrange them all in a row and discuss multiple topics in a single episode. And I have arranged these in a playlist, assembled them in a playlist rather, which you can listen to here on BBOR. In addition to liking and subscribing, you can also check out some playlists on the channel. But I was shocked the other week when I saw that there were 48 items in a playlist, and I was like, wow, 48? I mean, has it been that long? Yeah, it's been almost a year. Now it's even closer. But yeah, last year on the channel I did briefly mention the I-65 killer, and the I-65 killer was a serial killer who was identified after years. And I'm just going to go over to an article from WDRB.com, which was written by Dalton Godbey, just citing the source. And it says, Indianapolis. Law enforcement authorities have identified a serial killer who has eluded police for more than 35 years. Investigators dubbed the murderer the I-65 killer or the Days Inn killer after 3 women working at motels along the I-65 corridor in Indiana and Kentucky were killed. During a news conference Tuesday morning, authorities identified the suspect as Harry Edward Greenwell. Police say that Greenwell died in 2016 at the age of 68. An obituary indicated that he died from cancer. Sergeant Glenn Fifield of Indiana State Police had said that a laboratory analysis of crime scene samples positively identified Greenwell as the I-65 killer. And immediately, I think that stories like this, as well as perhaps some more famous ones, such as the Golden State Killer, give us hope that one day, some way, somehow, the Zodiac Killer could be identified. Greenwell had an extensive criminal history and had been in and out of prison several times, even escaping from jail on 2 separate occasions. He was known to travel frequently in the Midwest. And this is something that a lot of people were very much in doubt of in the past when they say that like people are proposing Zodiac killer suspects who have long criminal histories and they're like, well, this guy couldn't even get away with shoplifting or peeping into somebody's window, voyeurism or something, being a peeping Tom. How on earth could he have gotten away with the Zodiac killer crimes? I mean, like he fails at the easy basic level stuff, yet he succeeds at the advanced difficult stuff. How is that possible? Well, it really is just a characteristic of serial killer behavior that many serial killers do have a long criminal history, a series of previous criminal actions which escalate ultimately to murder, and it's not impossible that a killer can learn from his mistakes as a criminal in the past. Back to the I-65 killer. The first murder happened on February 21st of 1987 at the Super 8 Motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Vicky Heath, age 41, became the first known victim. Her body was found behind a dumpster outside the motel. She had been shot and sexually assaulted. And when you hear these specific details, this does seem like someone who is not only targeting women for a sexual reason, by the nature of traveling frequently, using motels, he is avoiding capture by not staying in the same place for very long. And again, that's quite different than the Zodiac, who committed his crimes relatively within what we call the Bay Area, but Vallejo, Napa County, excuse me, and within somewhat of the same geographic area. 2 years later, in March of 1989, police said the killer murdered 2 more people, 24-year-old Margaret Gill, also known as Peggy, and 34-year-old Jean Gilbert. Gill disappeared while working at the Days Inn in Merrillville, Indiana on March 2nd. Her body was found at the end of a vacant hall. She had been raped and shot twice in the head. Police say sometime after Gill was murdered, the killer drove 52 miles south on the I-65 to the Remington Days Inn, where he abducted Gilbert and drove her to County Road 150 West, just northwest of Brookston in White County. She had also been shot 3 times and was sexually assaulted. We'll never know what the killer was thinking. We'll never learn from any of his actions and the whys of his actions, said Gilbert's daughter Kim, whose name is now Kim Gilbert Wright. And that's just where we sit today. Investigators collected numerous pieces of evidence containing the killer's DNA. Law enforcement from Kentucky and Indiana emphasized how important it was that investigators were smart enough to collect and preserve those samples even before DNA was as crucial as it is now. The detectives back then were very forward-thinking. I would almost say they were ahead of their time with the type of things they collected that ended up being one of the things that solved this case, such as DNA, Elizabethtown Police Detective Justin Hendricks said. Okay, now that is absolutely not the case with the Zodiac Killer mystery, because the Zodiac was someone who committed some very sloppy homicides. But I was just on one of the pages for a Zodiac Killer Facebook group, and somebody posted a photo of the detectives handling the evidence barehanded, and a lot of possibilities for extracting forensic material that could solve the case have been ruined. The killer sexually assaulted a female employee during an armed robbery at a Days Inn in Columbus, Indiana on January 2nd, 1990. The woman was survived and was able to give police an excellent description and details to the crime, which led to a composite sketch of the suspect. She is the only known victim to have survived the killer's attack. Alright, so with the I-65 killer, are you noticing an infrequency in this killer's behavior, which I think is rather odd for a sexually motivated serial killer? Firstly, he's going after women almost years apart, and in some cases, years apart. Then, after a relatively short time, he goes after two women. I think that maybe that was just some type of overhype on his own emotions and urges. But yes, definitely not a very prolific serial killer. And in fact, this goes to show that maybe there is a contributing factor to his behavior other than sex. And there's also the concept of what I call the frustrated serial killer, somebody who only commits these crimes when he's at a low point in life, during a period of unemployment, or maybe he's been divorced, broken up, or rejected by a partner, something to that effect. And I'm not saying that's what happened with Harry Greenwell, this person here. I would simply think that it's a possibility or something of the sort. Law enforcement officers hope the announcement brings closure to the families of the three women who were killed. You never gave up, FBI Special Agent Herbert Stapleton said to the family victims at the news conference. I hope today's announcement shows law enforcement and investigators that they should never give up either. And definitely not for the Zodiac Killer mystery. I mean, there might be some DNA breakthrough. There might be a deathbed confession. That could still happen here in the 2000s. Or also, somebody might uncover a piece of evidence, such as Paul Stein's wallet or another piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, and they would find out that, yes, indeed, that was the killer. Also, perhaps, does the lake bury us a hood if it had the victim's blood on it? Something to that effect. We're all now able to share in the healing process, and the long-known attacker has been brought out of the dark and into the light. Police said that there are some other incidents that are rumored to be connected to Greenwell, and investigators said they are looking into those. Well, as a concluding note on the I-65 killer, I think that it's horribly unlikely that he only committed 3 murders and 1 sexual assault. Based on the nature of his crimes, I would expect that there were more victims, and I would really want to know if they have the forensic evidence to prove that. But thank you to Midnight Ventures for proposing this topic. It is a very saddening case, rest in peace to the victims, but also it goes to show that not all serial killers operate in the same way, and I mean, it could be possible that was an infrequent serial killer who committed these crimes at odd times, a year gap, 2-year gap for a particular reason, or maybe there were more victims and we simply just aren't aware of everything that the I-65 killer did. We'll definitely pay attention to the news and see if there are any new developments. And I would like to conclude with the supporter shoutouts. As I said, anybody who helps support the show, not only on BuyMeACoffee.com, but also via the super thanks here on YouTube, will get a shout out. And this week's supporter is Batman66. Thank you so much for your continued support of the show. All is greatly appreciated. And not only that, but also following along with the Jack the Ripper series, which comes out every Wednesday. And I guess there is one additional statement that I would like to read off, and that comes to us from I Am Not Paul Avery, who says, "You need merchandise. I'm thinking black 100% heavy cotton t-shirts with the Zodiac symbol in the front and the Zodiac Killer channel written on the back. I buy a couple, or coffee mugs, big 24-ounce mugs. I drink tons of coffee daily. I'd buy at least one." Well, I've definitely been there with the whole caffeine addiction aspect, as well as specifically a coffee addiction aspect, and I do love large coffee mugs. But a long time ago, I decided that I was not going to sell any merchandise that featured anything about the Zodiac Killer, and that is because, at the end of the day, the Zodiac Killer was a murderer, or at the very least, real homicides took place back in 1969. And some people have sold Zodiac Killer merchandise in the past, and that's just something that I don't necessarily want to participate in. But the only time that I've truly been tempted to do that is to have something in the merchandise store on the Teespring page that says Zodiac Monday, because that's not even necessarily about the murders. That's the name of this segment here. The unofficial name of what you're listening to right now is, of course, you might see the name Zodiac Killer News Report, but everybody knows this as Zodiac Monday, and it is another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. So, I have been tempted to do that, but as of now, I have not released any merchandise with that name on it. But, I mean, that one I could consider for the future. But there is always the Teespring page. You can look at some of the things that say Black Box Online Radio. That definitely is not trying to promote or endorse or shine the light on anything related to a killer. That is purely about the discussions that are happening on YouTube. Now, as for the Zodiac Killer channel, that is where you can listen to the Zodiac Killer interviews with the expert series, as well as the documentary Obsession into the Darkness and all of their suspect videos. I do not have any ownership of that channel. I have been a contributor over there and I've done voice recordings for them, but I don't have any real direction in the creative process. If they were to do something like that, release Zodiac Killer merchandise, that it would be purely their decision. I mean, as far as me selling anything that said Zodiac Killer channel, that's not my channel. I am just a contributor to someone else's project, and I'm really just hoping that we're going to get back to the Zodiac Killer interviews with the expert series. From time to time, people write into the comment section saying that they want to hear more interviews on that channel. I was the host of them. I would like to participate in more interviews on the Zodiac Killer channel as the host. So I think that that is something we should definitely do in the future. I know the guys over there wanted to concentrate on the podcast Serial Killer Z to A, and I invite you to listen once again, iHeartRadio and Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. But let's see what happens in the near future. And this will be Zodiac Monday signing off. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.